We are now.
Okay, good. All right, this meeting is called to order. Welcome. I want to thank the trustees-elect and public for participating this evening. The agenda is going to be short. It's the pledge, followed by the trustee roll call and AJ's 20 to 30-minute presentation. We'll follow that up with a 15-minute trustee Q&A. Obviously, the trustees can talk to AJ whenever they want, but for the purposes of this meeting, we'll add some time in case they have any questions. Now, in general, questions were submitted prior to the meeting as advertised, and the questions will be posted, the answers will be posted on the village website after the meeting. There is no public question period in the agenda, but we want all of you to be heard. So jot down your questions you may have during the presentation and send them to AJ before the close of business tomorrow. He will answer them, and then we'll post those on the website as well. Please rise if you're able for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Trustee roll call, please.
Mayor McFadden,
Present.
Deputy Mayor Shaw, Trustee Gluck,
Present.
Trustee Tasker,
Here.
Trustee McHugh,
Present.
all present.
Thank you. I'm pleased to introduce AJ Reyes. He's our lakes manager from New England Aquatic Research. AJ, the floor is yours.
How did it?
All right, great.
If I may, though, folks, if you are attending, please turn your mic off during the presentation. Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to go share my screen. Let's see. Actually, hold on. I'm going to share the other screen. I'm still working on this a little bit. All right. All right. Can you guys see just the regular presentation?
Yep.
Yes.
All right, great. So as David mentioned, my name is AJ Reyes. I'm an aquatic ecologist and certified lake manager working with Northeast Aquatic Research. We are a consulting firm working in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And we have been the lake managers for Tuxedo Lake for the past 3 years, since about 2019. So this is our third field season working with the lake. So today we're going to quickly discuss some of the, the management around the Tuxedo Lakes, particularly the management of Eurasian water milfoil. So very quick and dirty outline here. We're just going to define the problem. We're going to talk a little bit about Eurasian water milfoil, why it's an issue, why we want to manage it. I'm going to go through some management options in terms of how, what we've thought about in terms of what we think is the most effective approach to manage these particular this particular problem. We're going to key in on one of the more I think potentially effective management techniques in Percelicore, and I'll talk at length about the way that sort of works, and then I guess we'll leave some time for some questions for the trustees at the end. So a lot of this plan is probably not new to anyone, especially that you spend a lot of time around the lake. This is Eurasian water milfoil. It is a very aggressive, invasive plant, and when I say invasive, I'm talking about the fact that this plant actually did not originate in the US. This is a plant from Europe that actually was introduced to the US through the aquarium trade. So a lot of people like to put plants in their aquariums and they look really nice next to their fish. However, once they're done with those particular plants, they ended up either dumping them down the toilet or for the purposes of lakes, they actually put them into ponds and lakes, and then these plants can sort of spread. The big problem, and once again, this is nothing new to anyone who spent any sort of time on Tuxedo or any of the other lakes, is that they form these really dense monocultures that are able to shade out competitors, so the native plants that are beneficial to the flora and fauna. They also reduce fish habitat. It's not good for any fisherman to have really thick, dense milfoil, dense plants in general. You need a little bit of space there, so it can actually harm fish. And also, it contributes to the lake aging and the increased accelerated what we call eutrophication. So each year when these plants grow and they die off, they contribute a lot of sediment and organic material to the bottom of the lake, which eventually over a long period reduces, I guess you could say, the health of the lake. It's going to increase the oxygen demand, potentially increase the nutrients that are available for some of the harmful algae. that we see both in some of the lakes here, but also in the nation. We're starting to see an increase in those. Another thing I wanted just to note really quickly is that it's not just all ecological effects. There's been a multitude of studies looking at the effects of invasive species on property values. And consistently, pretty much across the board, if you have an invasive species in the lake, and if it's at some sort of abundance that's going to be harming recreation or harming sort of use, there is a trickle-down effect or a trickle-up effect to the property values. And multiple studies have shown this as well. So it's not just an ecological reason to sort of control these invasive species. There also is a strong economic reason as well. So quickly jumping into Tuxedo Lake. Once again, this isn't a lot of new information for you guys, but milfoil is basically distributed around the entirety of the lake. Multiple dense patches, both at the Tuxedo Club, at the Village Boathouse, especially as you go, you're in the northern end by the outlet in the tennis courts. As you kind of go down the lake towards the west side, very, very dense patches. There really is only a very sparse amount of area that doesn't have any milfoil. And these areas usually are just characterized by really rocky, steep soils. So in my opinion, the vast majority of the area that milfoil can colonize at the moment is colonized in Tuxedo Lake. And last year, we estimated it to be around 39 acres of plants. Between 2019 and 2020, it really didn't change all that much because there wasn't any management. So 39 acres is still a fairly accurate estimate, in my opinion. So as you can see, lots of plants here. Now, in a little bit of contrast to the big lake, there was some pretty significant management that happened on the two smaller lakes, on Pond 3 and Weewa. In Pond 3, it was treated with Procelacor in 2020, and I'm going to talk a lot more about Procelacor. That is an EPA registered aquatic herbicide. So if you have any questions about that, that'll be coming in a little bit. And we thought the treatment was very, very, very successful in 2020. So there was no milfoil found after the treatment about 2 months after in August. Which was exactly consistent with what we've seen both in laboratory studies and what we've seen in some of the other field sites that we've noticed. Unfortunately, we found some milfoil in 2021. I don't have a map of that yet. We were just out there last week. However, I really believe that this is actually coming from the feeder stream that connects Tuxedo to Pond 3. Multiple times during field surveys and during water quality collections, we would see milfoil growing within the stream leading to the lake. And we did try to put fragment barriers in those areas, but fragment barriers aren't 100% effective because you need to let water through as well. So basically, there's this idea that these lakes are interconnected, and I'm going to talk about that in another slide. But basically, I thought the herbicide worked really well. Unfortunately, there seemed to be a reintroduction from plants basically from the upstream Tuxedo area, either Tuxedo or actually in the stream itself. Weewa actually didn't get any herbicide treatment. However, there was 5 days of diver-assisted suction harvesting, which I will touch on a little bit more in 2020. I thought it was actually decently successful in reducing the density across the entire lake. If you notice, we have a pre-harvest and a post-harvest map. The size of the bubbles indicate the density at each particular waypoint that we took. And as you can see in the August waypoint, we did have a reduction in density across most of the sites that we saw. However, even though we had a reduction in density, the plant was still sort of abundant, or it was widespread throughout the entire lake. So there was a good job done, and the divers, I think, did the best job they could considering the time that they had. However, there was still a bunch of milfoil there. And unfortunately, in 2021, just kind of looking at it in the last week, it seems like the milfoil is starting to increase and potentially increase to levels that were above what we saw last June. So preliminarily, it just seems like, even though I think the dash harvesters worked, as hard as they possibly could, it seems like, at least the 5 days in 2020 was not enough to sort of stem growth in future years. So I mentioned this a little earlier, but I think this is really important to understand for the total management of these lakes is that, these lakes are interconnected, both hydrologically and also sort of in their management. If you have fragments that are being generated in Tuxedo, and I should mention that when milfoil sort of breaks off, the stems can actually reproduce in other areas. So sometimes if you're around the lake, you'll see a stem floating and it has a bunch of white roots on it. That particular plant can drop down on the soil and actually root again and create a whole new population. So because of the interconnected nature of the lakes, management needs to sort of take that all into account. So if you're doing a particular management action on Pond 3 or on Weewa, if the source population is not controlled, the longevity of whatever action you're going to take in those lakes is going to be compromised. And I think that's what we exactly saw in 2021. Despite the excellent work of the excellent results of the herbicide that we noticed in 2020, we did seem to see a reintroduction. And the same thing with WIWA. As much as the divers are going to work hard in WIWA, if there's going to be a reintroduction of these plants from an upstream source, it's going to basically lead to a not as satisfactory result in the long term. So we're just going to talk about some plant management options. So the way I separated this out is I basically have the two options that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, which are diver-assisted suction harvesting and the application of herbicides. But I wanted to also just quickly touch on some of the other options that I considered, but ultimately thought were not a good fit for the situation at Tuxedo. So drawdown is the first one, and drawdown is the concept that you artificially lower the level of the water to expose the sediment to basically kill off any of the above ground plant material. Now, a lot of lakes do this, and a lot of lakes are actually pretty successful at this. However, in Tuxedo, because the water kind of goes over the dam and there's no underwater valve to be able to drain the water any more than, I believe, 16 inches. That was the last time when I spoke to John Ledwith about that. Unfortunately, that technique is just not viable at the moment. If it came in the future that the dam was repaired and there was some sort of a deep valve that could actually draw the lake down a little bit further, we could explore that. But at the moment, it's not really a technique that we can even utilize in Tuxedo at the moment. So with grass carp, this is another technique that a lot of different lakes, especially in the Northeast, use. They are sterile carp that are introduced to basically eat aquatic vegetation. They're basically aquatic cows for the, aquatic goats, for lack of a better term. The problem with them is that there really is an inability to predict an accurate stocking rate. So it's very hard to know how many fish are going to actually achieve the desirable outcome. If you stock too little fish, what will happen is that you'll either have no effect or you actually spur milfoil to grow even faster because milfoil is not one of its most preferred food items. So what will happen is if at a low stocking rate, they'll actually eat all the native plants we want to keep, but let the milfoil sort of grow out of control. And we've seen that in a few different lakes. On the contrary, if you stock too many, you'll actually run the risk of wiping out everything in the lake. In terms of the dominant aquatic plants in Tuxedo, milfoil is really on the lower preferred end. So they're going to eat everything else before they eat milfoil. So if you stock too high, they definitely will get rid of the milfoil. The problem is that they will get rid of everything else. And that can have cascading effects to fisheries and water quality. So the other technique that some lakes use, we haven't recommended it in a very long time. It is a mechanical harvester. The idea is to put a reciprocating blade down into the water in this large machine, and it cuts the plants at a certain depth, and then that material is brought back onto the boat and then dumped off onto a shoreline or some sort of a dump site, either onto a barge or right directly to the shore. This technique is extremely messy, as it will create fragments all over the place. Even with a barge on the backside trying to skim, you're going to basically fragment all that milfoil, spread it all around the lake. It's also an extremely short term technique. I manage lakes over on the other side of the river that basically have to cut every 2 weeks and still have their milfoil about 70%, 80% in the water column. So it really is it's a messy technique, and it's extremely short term, and there's a whole bunch of other considerations as well. And it's just not something I think would be appropriate for the situation at Tuxedo. So now to touch on some of the techniques that I think have a little bit more viability in Tuxedo situation. So one of the techniques that I know has had a lot of conversation around it in the park is the diver assisted suction harvesting, or termed DASH. The concept of DASH is basically divers go down to the bottom of the water and they pull the individual plants from the sediment, and they usually transfer them to a hose that brings those plants up to the surface, and then they can get processed by the larger barge. A good way to think about it is just kind of weeding your lawn with a vacuum. If you could just, instead of having to put everything in a bag, you kind of put it in a vacuum and it puts it in a bag for you. That's the kind of the best analogy I could think of. It is a highly selective technique, and that is one of the benefits of this technique. Divers can go down and they can actually pick up native plants, or they can pluck non-native plants like milfoil and leave native plants like your large leaf palm weeds and your eel grasses and all those other things. So if there's areas that have mixed beds, it's really good for something like that. Unfortunately, it is as anyone who's ever weeded their garden can understand, it is very, very labor intensive, extremely labor intensive. Usually you need multiple passes to cover an area sufficiently. Part of the reason is because when the divers are down there weeding, if they pull up a few plants and it's a muddy area, that sediment's going to come up a little bit, and then the visibility is going to be blurred. So it's very possible that they'll miss a whole bunch of plants on their first pass. So what they have to do is they have to let the sediment settle out and then come back on a second pass, and sometimes even a third pass. So obviously that increases the time that they're out there for. Also, substrate is very important as well. If you have milfoil between two pieces of bedrock, it's going to be very hard for the divers to control that, because the roots are kind of stuck inside and down in those the sections of shale, and basically the plant's just going to regrow anyway, right? So they can just take out the top part, but it's going to be very hard for them to get to the bottom. And then I just talked about how mucky sediments are also present their own challenges. It can be effective for small populations. We manage a whole bunch of lakes in New York and Connecticut that do dash harvesting on smaller populations, and we think are very successful, both for native plants and for invasive. The problem is that once it gets above that 5 acres, maybe closer to 10 acres, you really run into a lot of issues. One being cost, and other being some sort of secondary effects on top of cost. And that sort of leads me into my last point about this, is that this is a tough job. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Having a diver go down there and basically individually pull plants for 40 hours a week, and then 2, 3, 4 weeks on top of that, is a really tough and grueling job. And then especially if they're having turbidity issues, if there's tough weather. So as you extend the life of these programs, oftentimes you get diver fatigue, and their efficiency in the very beginning, right, in the first 5, 10, 15 hours of them doing it, is going to be a lot better than on hour 45, hour 50. You know what I mean? We're working with humans here, right? We're not working with robots. So you have to expect that some of that efficiency will sort of drop off. And we do see that a lot. So those are sort of considerations with that. So one of the most well-known large lake dash efforts, and I kind of distinguish the large lake here, because that's sort of analogous to what we would be talking about in Tuxedo, is this project on Upper Saranac Lake. It is widely considered probably the most successful large lake dash effort. And what they did is basically from 2004 to 2006, they invested a significant amount into the budget, but they were able to reduce the amount of milfoil, I think pretty significantly for about 3 years of intensive management. For about 2004 to 2006, they spent about $1 million. Some of the costs, it varies based on, if you include consulting costs, if you include the studies that they've done. Some studies say it's 1.5 million. It kind of depends where you draw the line, but it was well over $1 million for those 3 years. And then after that, they were able to reduce to about $292,000 around those 2 years. And then basically from 2008 on to currently, as of today, 2020, they're spending about a little bit over $100,000 each year. So a very significant financial investment, but they did get some positive results out of there. It took a while. The first 3 years, basically, I don't have the numbers here, but they basically spent around $375,000 a year, give or take. It kind of fluctuated. And then after that, they were able to sort of knock it down. The important thing to remember here too, though, is this is a little bit of a different situation than Tuxedo. Even though Upper Saranac is a lot larger of a lake, the amount of milfoil in Upper Saranac is not really analogous to what's in Tuxedo. So this table here I have shows basically the percentages of the percent littoral zone covered by the milfoil in different categories. So in 2004, only 3% of the littoral zone had 50% or more milfoil. I know it's kind of a little bit of a tongue twister. But basically, so only 3% of the lake had more than 50%, 3% of the littoral zone only had 50% or more milfoil. If you look at the map that I have here, which we're measuring percent cover as well, even though it says density, but we are measuring percent cover, you can clearly see that the majority of the lake in Tuxedo is more than 50% coverage. So in the situation at Upper Saranac, the milfoil was not nearly as dense as the milfoil is in Tuxedo. And I'm going to talk about why that's important when we start talking about scaling up and what a dash project would actually look like on Tuxedo. Also, it's important to remember that in the first year, there was already 37% of the entire littoral zone had no milfoil as well. So once again, it's not exactly apples to apples here. So talking about the cost of Dash and how sort of, what would have to entail, what would have to kind of go into build a successful Dash program. Dash is expensive. There's sort of no two ways around it. Diving is expensive. The good estimate for a good crew is about $2,000 per day per crew. And the best estimate we had are around 6 to 10 days to clear 1 acre. And this is with some repasses and stuff. And now that 6 acre number is basically if you have a sparse amount of milfoil, right? If there's a stem here, if there's a stem there, divers are able to handle it relatively easily. I think somebody shared their screen. Oh, David, I think I can't hear your.
Okay, someone just logged on and is using screen share in the Zoom feature. And I'd like to ask that person to leave screen share.
It looks like it's Charlie McNary.
Okay, Charlie, can you get out of screen share? And then, as we discussed earlier this evening, Elizabeth, we have to reset the settings so that no one can screen share without permission. This individual has on one of their tabs 11 benefits of strength training. Does that sound familiar to anyone? More June news and TPFYI. And who is it again, please, Elizabeth?
Charlie McNary.
Does anybody know who Charlie is? In the content of contacting him? We don't want to see any embarrassing moments. Perfect. Okay, AJ, it looks like you can take over again.
Sure. All right.
Thank you, Charlie.
See how this works. All right. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Perfect. So as I was saying, 6 days is sort of your conservative estimate in terms of 6 days to clear 1 acre. That's kind of sparse milfoil. And then 6 days is your more aggressive estimate. And then 10 days is your more conservative estimate. This is sort of the really kind of dense, topped out, really thick milfoil. I think the majority of Tuxedo, kind of falls more into that 8 to 10 day range based on, what we're seeing out on the lake. So this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but I want to kind of walk you guys through it to kind of show you my thinking on this. Obviously, I am not the particular Dash contractor. This is my experience with dealing with Dash contractors on multiple different projects. Obviously, the price will vary a little bit around these numbers, but I think this is a good general sort of framework to think about this. So in year one, in my opinion, you would probably want to have 3 crews come out at about $6,000 per day. Some people can do a little bit less than that depending on their individual business model, but I think about 3 crews would be pretty appropriate. So if you remember, I said that 1 crew can clear about 1 acre in anywhere from 6 to 10 days. It obviously depends on the vegetation density. We're also working with 39 acres of plants. And, it's important to remember that with this Dash harvesting effort, you really have to harvest the entirety of the lake. That's exactly what Upper Saranac did. You can't, you could harvest half of the lake. However, the other half that's unharvested is just going to fragment at the end of the year and potentially repopulate all those areas again. So you're going to be starting off in year 2 in a much less advantageous position than you would normally be in year 1. So it is a legitimate question to say, well, do we really have to harvest the entire lake? Once again, you could do half of it, but I think that, based on some of the other stuff we've seen, and also based on conversations with Dash harvesters themselves, is all those other milfoil plants that are untouched are just going to recolonize. I mean, milfoil, that's what its most aggressive feature is, basically recolonizing areas. And another thing to note as well, before we kind of get into some of the math here, is for Dash harvesting, there's really only 105 work days from May 15th to October 15th. This is obviously this is, no weekends, no holidays, and then not included in the 105, but you also have bad weather days and equipment failures and those sorts of things. So if we were to go back to our 6 acres and our 10 acre estimate, or 6 days per acre and 10 days per acre estimate that I mentioned before that represent a sparse milfoil scenario and a dense milfoil scenario, we can see sort of we can get to the range of price we can expect for a year one cost. So if you have 1 acre per 6 days, that's obviously $6,000 per day for 3 crews. That means that 3 crews can probably handle 2 days for an acre. I know, once again, stay with me here. So 2 days per acre. So the total days needed to harvest 39 acres would be about 78 days, which translates to about $468,000 on the more, I guess, aggressive end, right? If the milfoil is sparse, that's what I would expect to see. If you did the more conservative estimate where you said, all right, the milfoil is really dense, that number increases to about $774,000. And that's because the total days needed to harvest 39 acres is now 129 days instead of it being the 78 days. And once again, going back here, the three crews, instead of handling 1 acre of milfoil in 2 days, it's going to take about 3.3 days to handle that 1 acre of milfoil. So that's where the difference is. Once again, a lot of different math here, but the point is that we're looking at roughly this 468 number to about 774 as sort of an estimate here. Now, to kind of put this all together in terms of putting into context, the potential cost of an effective DASH program to basically get all the milfoil in the lake, it's important to remember that at least, and this also happened in Upper Saranac, and this is also what the DASH harvesters recommend, you really need to repeat the same effort over 3 years. And that's partially because you don't really know what the regrowth is going to be in that second year. The majority of projects have significant regrowth in year 2. And when success happens, it's usually in year 4, year 5, year 6 of intense harvesting. So to be safe, I would want to say you would want to increase, you would want to keep the same effort for the first 3 years into that program, whichever, if it's at that lower estimate or at that upper estimate. So as you can see, the total 3-year cost is around $1.4 million to about $2.3 million for a really solid, intensive 3-year DASH program. And if this program was followed, I do believe there would be significant reductions in milfoil. I think no doubt about it. I mean, this would be the perfect way to sort of go about this. The DASH harvesters would be able to basically cover the entirety of the lake throughout the entire season, and you would have, and this also accounts for passing through multiple passes through areas. So just to give you an idea of sort of what would entail in my opinion, a proper DASH harvesting product or strategy. So we'll quickly talk about Procelacor. So Procelacor is a new systemic auxin mimic herbicide. I'm going to explain what that means. It's kind of a mouthful. Registered for use in 2017. It has rapid impact on target plants. Usually you see signs of impact within a week or two, and then the plants actually drop out of the water column in about 3 to 4 weeks, which is consistent to what we saw in Pond 3. It is highly selective towards Eurasian water milfoil, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, rapid degradation. A lot of the times, the residue is basically non-detect 24 hours after putting it into the water body. There's 2 formulations in the US, the EC and the SC formulation. The difference is just the percent of active ingredient. In the Northeast, the EC is the one that would be used for controlling milfoil in the Northeast. So mode of action. I won't spend too much time on this, but basically it's a really interesting concept. These herbicides are part of a class of herbicides called auxin mimics. And basically what they're doing is they are mimicking the natural growth hormones that are within the plants normally. And they actually trick the plants into doing things they wouldn't normally do. So some of them trick the plants into basically outgrowing their carbohydrate stores. So sometimes you'll start to see plants start to spin and actually grow really vigorously, but not sustainably. They'll start to curl and bend within the first week or so of treatment. Other auxin mimics they'll actually block sodium channels, so they'll stop ion transport throughout the stem. So they're really kind of messing with the plant on the inside versus some of the contact herbicides, which are physically burning the plant. So this is more of a I guess the best word would be as a saboteur of the particular the plants that they're working on. And you see this sort of in 3 phases. You have the stimulation phase where you have this crazy, just unchecked growth and just all these signals firing off inside the plant. Then you have the inhibition phase where they get to the point where, oh, well, we can't do anything now. We can't end up growing. And then they have the decay phase. So that's generally how these auxin mimics work. So Procellocor use rates. Two numbers to be very cognizant of and for the next few slides is the maximum label rate, which is basically the amount, the highest amount that the state will allow you to put in a water body at any time, which is 50 micrograms per liter. And then the common use rate, which is how much is actually needed to control milfoil. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's a pretty big difference between these two numbers. So the state is allowing groups to put in up to 50 micrograms per liter, but you really only need about 3.86 to 5.79 micrograms per liter to actually control milfoil. So it really can control milfoil at low use rates. So what does it actually do to milfoil? So there's a few different studies looking at milfoil. I chose Beets et al. Because I thought it had a good combination of both invasive and native plant testing. So what we're looking at here is looking at a range of concentrations and exposure times for Procellocor and looking at the response of Eurasian water milfoil in a mesocosm setting. And this blue arrow indicates where we think the proposed tuxedo concentration would be that would go into the water. Like I said, between that 3.8 to 5.6 number. And as you can see, basically every single exposure scenario, both in duration and concentration of active ingredient, results in a greater than 90% reduction in the Eurasian water milfoil throughout all of the different exposures. So clearly it is highly, highly effective on Eurasian water milfoil. Now, the logical question is, all right, if it's really effective on milfoil, what is it going to do to the natives, right? We don't want to put something into the lake that's going to really negatively impact the natives while also negatively impacting the invasives. That kind of defeats the point. So the same paper looked at a whole bunch of native species. On the left here, we have American pondweed and Illinois pondweed with the same setup with the arrow showing exactly where the concentration rate would be, or the proposed rate would be. And as you can see, based on the controls, which is this first bar, there really isn't a big difference between the controls and what we see at all these different exposure scenarios, which is obviously much different than what we saw with milfoil. American pondweed and Illinois pondweed, we actually don't have those in Tuxedo. However, we have a close cousin, largeleaf pondweed, which is in the same genus. So even though we don't have the exact toxicological information for that particular species, we do know that we have two in the same genus that haven't had any significant effect. And in my opinion, it's appropriate to sort of extrapolate out to that different genus and say, all right, we don't think it's as effective. Also, on the converse, other milfoil species are highly affected by Procellocor. So it's not, it's something that that you can sort of interpret between the different species. This plant over here, Valsinaria, actually is in Tuxedo, and I would consider it probably the third most abundant native plant. It's eelgrass. It basically is this long, stringy, kind of tape-like looking plant. And as you can see, compared to the controls, no real impact. So based on the study, we can conclude that the native plants really are they're kind of unaffected by the Procellocor treatment, which is what we want to see. Right, we want to see a lot of impact on the invasive, but minimal impact on the natives. Now, if we jump into some of the toxicological information, I think mussels are a great place to go. And the reason why mussels are a great place to go is because oftentimes they're the most sensitive of aquatic organisms. Mussels in the water, they're going to be filter feeding. They have a siphon that sticks out of their shell. And so they're constantly accumulating toxins and accumulating water at a much higher rate than other animals and plants would. It's a much higher exposure per se. So Busick et al. Looked at Procellocor, both the EC and SC version, and the active ingredient metabolite, and tested it against some of these juvenile freshwater mussels. They saw that the LC50, so when I say LC50, I mean that is the concentration to where 50% of the test organisms had a negative response. It's a very common sort of delimiter in dose response toxicological studies. Shows that it's greater, so that value is greater than the maximum label rate. So what that means is that at the maximum label rate, that 50 micrograms per liter, less than 50% of all the organisms died. It was even higher than that, right? So we're seeing much, really a very good toxicological profile in terms of mortality. Now, another thing that these toxicological studies do is they look at sublethal effects, and that's where this no observable adverse effect concentration. Sometimes scientists aren't good at abbreviating stuff for us. But so what this is looking at all the sublethal effects, right? So the stuff that's obviously not going to cause mortality, but stuff that will cause, let's say, decreased growth, decreased reproductive function, lethargy, all the things that we don't want to happen, but could happen at a concentration, let's say, potentially lower than the than what we would than maybe the LC50 was. So what we saw for Procellacor was this concentration limit to where there was actually effects is actually 11.7 times higher than the maximum label rate. So if you translate it, and this is kind of where I'm tying this all back in together, if you translate it to what you would actually use in the lake, which is that 3.8 to 5.6 micrograms per liter, that translates to about, you would have to put 101 times the amount of product needed in the water to have a deleterious impact on the freshwater mussels, which are some of our most sensitive organisms we have. So looking at some other toxicological information, I'm getting close to the end here. I know I'm talking about a lot of numbers here, but when we look at different mammals, both rats, we looked at rats both in, I didn't look at, but the studies did, rats oral and dermal, and then rats inhalation. As you can see, this concentration to affect the organisms negatively, that's basically what the dose was at the time to exhibit a negative effect. As you can see, they're much, much, much higher than what we would normally put in. And I actually made an error here. This should be micrograms per liter, so I apologize there. But basically, the kind of take home here is this last row, which talks about this last column, which basically compares the amount that these studies use to elicit a negative response and compares that to what actually goes into the lake. So if you're talking about rats for oral and dermal exposure, it would have to be around 833,000 times the amount put into the water to be able to have a negative effect on rats in that sort of exposure. For inhalation, it's 900 times the amount. Common carp, which is a fish that you do have in Tuxedo, is about 533 times the amount that would actually go into the lake. And then Daphnia water fleas, which are the zooplankton we want to make sure are abundant in the lake, it's about 220 times the amount, right? So taking all of this into account, at the use rates proposed for the lake, right, that 3.6 to 5.8 level, I truly believe that it is not it should not be considered a threat to drinking water and to the ecosystem. And I have sent along a few papers to David and the board talking about these different studies, where I'm getting these numbers from. I have a section at the end for literature cited. So if you want to kind of double check these numbers and take a look at them for yourself, I can provide you with all that information. So what am I proposing for Tuxedo Lake? The idea here is I think that using an EPA registered herbicide would be the best option at the moment, but it's not just about the herbicide. The whole goal here is there's a lot of milfoil in Tuxedo Lake, and dash harvesting, in my opinion, it could potentially be done on its own to be able to control it. However, I just think, with the amount of investment that you would have to put in, and also the time that you would have to wait to get sort of a comparable result to the herbicide, I believe that the herbicide at the moment is the better option for the lake. The idea here is we want to manage from a position of strength, right? So what I would like to do is sort of have the year one knock down that plant biomass pretty significantly. And based on some of the lab studies and some of the monitoring I've done on the different lakes, including Little Weewah, I expect we should have about 90% control in the first year using an herbicide. I think that's, I would consider it's actually a conservative estimate considering what we've seen. But the idea is we're not giving up on Dash. We actually want to put Dash in a better position in year 2 and year 3. Have Dash come out when there's only 5 acres of plants, or where there's 2 acres of plants in sparse areas, so then the divers can kind of stay on top of that. I am not here basically proposing continuous herbicide treatment from here on until ever. That is not what I want to do, and it's not what I do for any lake. The reason why I'm proposing it is because I just think at this particular time, there's too much milfoil in the lake to be able to manage it by using dash only at the moment. So once again, get on top of the problem and then continue it out with dash into future years where dash can be more effective. And of course, we are going to be monitoring throughout the entire process. If you guys obviously will have us, we would be pre and post plant surveys to make sure we're testing the effectiveness of this herbicide. We'd also do residue testing if this is the way you want it to go, basically double checking the concentrations and making sure they're actually going down to the non-detects that they should be, you know, after a certain amount of time. Also coordination with the applicator. We want to be out there the day of application, make sure they're doing everything above board when it comes to this particular treatment. The last thing I'll say, and I kind of jumped to the bottom before I jump to the top, the cost for the year one treatment based on some previous proposals submitted by Solitude is around $110,000. And Solitude, they and other applicating companies do this. It's not just Solitude. On lakes that have a significant size of milfoil or other target plants, they'll actually propose a 3-year guarantee, which basically allows them to come back and treat the lake in sufficient years if the herbicide does not perform up to the standards that they set, right? That doesn't mean you have to do that, right? So if we got 95% control, I'd probably suggest for us to just continue on with dash, right? But if there was some reason why the herbicide failed, right, we only got 70% control, the company will come back at no additional charge and treat the different lakes. I mean, and once again, this isn't something specific to Tuxedo. They do this all the time when it comes to large herbicide treatments that they have a lot of confidence in. So there's my literature cited. Obviously, I'm going to provide all these studies to the village. And once again, my strategy here is, there's a lot of milfoil in the lake. Either way, either you go with dash or either you go with the herbicides, it really does have to be knocked down before, it has to be knocked down to a much, much lower level before we get to any sort of maintenance mode. So really what I'm suggesting is just, all right, how do we get to that point where we can sort of knock it down and keep it at that level? And once again, with what we've seen with the herbicides and what we've seen with the dash, in my opinion, the herbicides are a very good option to go do that. Once again, you could do dash, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with going to dash. It's just, with your group, and this is something you're going to have to decide. I can't decide this for you. Is that number, that potential estimate cost, is that something that your group is able to handle?
Thank you very much, AJ. That was really terrific and deep. This is a reminder also for the public to get your questions together and email them to EJ. And EJ, can I post that final version of your presentation online?
Yes, I'll send it over in a PDF. And
yeah, I think you wanted to make a correction on one of those size calculations. That was what you mentioned during the presentation.
Yeah, definitely. And I probably have a period I need to put somewhere.
Terrific. And as I said earlier, we'll post everything, all the questions and answers online without the individual asking the question's name. Okay, trustee question and comment section is now open for 15 minutes. I'm happy to go around the horn. Any trustee want to raise their hand and that has questions? Trustee McHugh.
Sure, I just got a couple questions. One, AJ, is with regard to when we did Percel-Core on pond number 3, what was the concentration level there versus what you're recommending on Tuxedo Lake?
I would have to look back at the particular applicator's proposal, but it was definitely within that 3.6 to 5 point range. I would imagine it's probably actually on the lower end. Usually the companies don't usually like to go up to the 6 amount unless there's some sort of feature about the lake that would prohibit, let's say, herbicide movement. So I worked on a lake just recently that's about 45 feet deep. It's only 45 acres. It's kind of this little kettle hole. And they wanted to go a little bit closer. They went to about 5 micrograms per liter because, a lot of the milfoil was actually in like 20 feet of water. So they wanted to account for the fact that, all right, we want to make sure that we're getting the herbicide all the way down there. We're going to put a little bit more at the surface with the hope that most of it's going to sort of get down to the bottom. But I'll have to look back into the specific number, but I'm almost positive it's between those two, that range I gave you.
Okay, then my next question was, and I understand why you ruled out on Tuxedo Lake, but on pond number 3 and Weewa using the drawdown method, obviously that worked to a degree on the Weewa when we were doing the dam repairs. We either eradicated a lot of pondweed or we reduced the level of Eurasian water milfoil. It seems to have come back with a vengeance. And what are you attributing that to? I mean, is it just downstream effect from Tuxedo Lake going through pond number 3 into the Weewa, or is there something else going on that we don't know yet?
So yeah, Weewa's a very interesting situation. I guess it was the year before I got involved. It was the major drawdown during the summer for Weewa. I think it's a combination of the two. Based on some of the old pictures I saw, I'm pretty and basically my first survey out there in 2019. I'm fairly confident the drawdown pretty much took out almost all the milfoil in that lake. The problem is that you still have the introductions from Pond 3. I think there was also some milfoil that sort of hung on by Warwick Brook area as well. And also what happens is that when you draw down the lakes, and this is one of the downsides to drawdowns, is you leave all of that sediment sort of exposed, right? So it's sort of a clean slate. And the idea is that it's sort of a race to see which plant is going to colonize. And the fact that milfoil can fragment and move around the lake so easily, it's a very, very efficient colonizer. So what I think happened is, once that first year where they basically, where the drawdown happened and they kind of cleared all that area, there was a race to see, all right, which plants are going to go in. And with milfoil, some milfoil coming in from Pond 3 potentially, and some maybe survival from like the Warwick Brook area, the milfoil said, well, I'm the best one here to do that, and just started colonizing. And now it sort of has unimpeded growth continuing throughout the lake, right? Because there's not, even though there's some native plants in Weewa, it's not like Tuxedo where you have some acres and acres of, let's say, largely pondweed or Valsinaria. It's sort of open, kind of free range. So the milfoil, there's almost nothing stopping its growth. And that's one thing I'm actually pretty concerned about in Weewa, because the middle of Weewa is about 15 feet, and we haven't seen any growth in the middle of Weewa for milfoil yet. However, that's not deep enough for me to be confident that milfoil will never grow there. It's possible it won't. I'm not saying that it's a for sure that it will, but it's not deep enough where I would say, oh, no, don't worry about it. So, Weewa, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few years in terms of that expansion. Will it stay in those sort of back cove areas, or will it actually start moving out into the middle?
Okay, and then this will be my last question, is just with regard to, obviously we did Priscilla core on pond number 3. What kind of success ratio would you assign that, given we did a post, and you've obviously done follow-up work continually last year on it? What would you attribute the success of the treatment on that body of water?
Yeah, so I think, in the year 2020, I think that the Priscilla core did an excellent job. The reason I say that is because when we went out about that 2 months after in August, we saw 0 plants. I mean, not even a stem, not even a little leaflet anywhere. And to me, that tells me that the herbicide worked exactly how it was supposed to work. Now, with the ink now in 2021, obviously we started to see some regrowth of milfoil. It's still not terribly abundant in the lake, right? So I'd still consider it what I would consider controlled per se, right? It's not really impacting people's direct recreation of the lake. However, it is obviously something I didn't want to see. So what I would say is that I think more than likely that is from the reintroduction from that either in that stream area or in Tuxedo itself. And once again, even in April and May, when I would go collect the water samples from Tuxedo into Pond 3, I'd spend some time and actually walk up the stream a little bit, and you can see the milfoil plants growing in the little pools of slow water inside of that stream. And obviously that stream didn't get any treatment. So that's why I kind of hammer home the point of this interconnected nature of these lakes. If you don't handle what's happening at the source, anything you do downstream is not going to have the same level of effect. And I think that's kind of what we saw.
Okay, so just for clarity's sake, because we've been using the word, or you've been using the word Tuxedo, are you specifically just addressing Tuxedo Lake, or are you suggesting doing Priscilla core on all 3 bodies in your presentation? Sorry.
So in the presentation, I am largely focusing on Tuxedo, as that's the one that hasn't had any management. And, yes, I have ideas on what we should do on Weewa and Pond 3, but the fact of the matter is, in my opinion, is that if you don't deal with Tuxedo, once again, it's, all the things you do below there. So, yes, pond 3, I mean, you could use another Procellochlor treatment there. Also, the milfoil is not too abundant in pond 3. You could also come in there with dash, right? I don't really have a strong recommendation one way or the other in terms of efficacy, right? WeWa is going to be a different situation. If WeWa starts to, and we have a post survey in August, if WeWa starts to get to the point where we start seeing that milfoil basically topped out all throughout the lake, I mean, I'll speak to the dash harvesters and we'll come up with an idea of how much we think is going to be, how many weeks they think they're actually going to need to get back on top of it. I think once we have that conversation, it'll really inform sort of where we go on the next steps. Because once again, if it starts to expand, we get back into the question that Tuxedo's facing, right? You're at the point where there's so much milfoil that can Dash actually keep up with it at a sort of, at sort of a reasonable level.
Okay, so perfect. So your $110,000 is basically for treating the littoral zone of Tuxedo Lake. Agreed?
Yes, and that is based on the proposal that Solitude gave you guys, right? So I didn't pull that number out of.
No, I understood. I just wanted clarification.
All right. Any other trustees?
Sure.
Okay. Yes, Paul.
Sure. Question. And thank you, AJ. That was very detailed, very thorough, and very helpful. I think I know I would, and probably the board would appreciate examples of other Procellochlor treatments in New York State drinking water reservoirs, if they exist, or in other states drinking water reservoirs. I'm assuming this isn't the first time Procellochlor has been used in a drinking water reservoir. So that would be helpful if you could follow up with that to the to the board members. And secondly, and I'm not in any way an advocate of this, but I think it might be helpful if you could give a little more color to what you think the impact on water quality would be if we did nothing. In other words, the milfoil's there, it's grown where it's going to grow. Obviously it's a nuisance to recreation and it's a mess, but I'm assuming that there is a significant impact in the future on water quality if we do nothing. If you could put a little more color into that, I think that would be helpful.
Sure, definitely. Just quickly to the drinking water, in some of the documents I sent over, and I'll double check to make sure I did that. I sent over some reports from New Hampshire where they did a Procellochlor treatment in a area that had a drinking water intake. I believe it was Lake Winnipesaukee, and that was forwarded to me by the state official in New Hampshire. So there is that, and I can follow up with more examples as well. In terms of the future impacts on water quality, if you have all that biomass in the lake, that milfoil at the end of the year, it's all dying off, right? It's not just staying in its kind of stalked form all the way up to the surface. When that milfoil dies off, it's going to be contributing sediment and organic material, and more importantly, nitrogen and phosphorus to the overlying sediments. And eventually, the lake is going to very, very slowly start to fill in. Now, we're talking over, 10,000 years here, right? In terms of the actual filling in. However, the more immediate effect is that organic material is going to be decomposed by bacteria, which in turn drops the oxygen concentrations in lakes at the bottom. And, if you remember back to my 2019 report, we talked about some significant oxygen depletion that was happening in Tuxedo Lake especially. And that stuff over a long time can really have negative impacts to your drinking water, because then you start to get into increased metals in terms of iron and manganese. You start to talk about increased harmful algae blooms because there's more phosphorus available. So definitely on a long-term period. Now, one of the short-term things that happens as well is when these plants are in these dense beds, they're pumping milfoil, or they're pumping nutrients from the sediment, and actually they're leaching nitrogen out of the leaves currently throughout the year. And it's also because these leaves, these little leaflets, the really small ones that have a bunch of little feathers on them, they look kind of like quills or feathers, they're constantly dying off throughout the entire year. And every time those die, they release soluble nutrients into the lake. And there's been plenty of studies that have shown the increase in soluble nitrogen and soluble phosphorus in these sort of dense beds. So in the very, very short term, it's not going to have that much of an impact on water quality. But if we're talking about long-term management of the lake, I certainly think that having just an unchecked amount of milfoil growing and dying each year would not be a good thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Trustee Castor.
Yep, thank you. AJ, thanks for the great presentation, all the information. Can you explain the length of time, the number of crews it takes to remove an acre using Dash? Can you just kind of recap the procedure for the application of Priscillacor in the lake and the amount of time it takes?
Sure. So what would happen, right? And is the village would submit a permit to the state, and in conjunction with a particular applicator, and that permit would go through a review between the different pesticide groups. It'll probably go over to fisheries in Region 3 and whoever else needs to see it, probably ecosystem health as well. It would, depending on the scope of the project, it may go out to public comment. You know, I'm not exactly sure what would happen there, but once you receive the permit, and let's say you get to, well, let me back up. Let's not get to treatment day yet. When you get the permit to do the treatment, or even before that, my group would have a meeting with the applicator to decide on, all right, how many acres are we treating? Where are we going to focus the most effort on? You know, what sort of residue testing do we need to do? On my end, I'm going to make sure that they are going, you know, they have a map of the entire area. I'm going to make sure that they're following that exact track around the lake. So we're basically going to kind of square away all those things before treatment day. On treatment day, they're probably going to come here, I'm guessing with the size of Tuxedo, I'm guessing they're probably going to come here with 2 airboats. Basically, they're boats with big fans on the back of them. And the reason why they do that is that they can get into really shallow water without having to worry about like dinging up their props or anything. They could do it on rowboats. It probably would cost a lot more money, but it could be done. And the idea is that they're going to take some of that concentrated chemical, and they have usually about a 100-gallon tank that sits on the boat, and they mix that with lake water at a rate that creates basically, it's called like the carrier concentration. So they mix the concentrated amount into that 100-gallon amount. And then as they're driving, they have pretty advanced technology where they basically can meter out a select amount of herbicide that hits the water. And based on the volume of water that we calculate basically during our pre-treatment, you know, consultation, they will basically put out an amount of herbicide that will get to that concentration of that 3.86 to 5.8 amount. And they'll circumnavigate the entire lake. Depending on the size of the littoral zone. When I say littoral zone, I mean the area that the plants are growing. They may do 1 pass or they may do 2 passes, right? So for example, the area that's directly south of Turtle Point Road, you know, that is a really, really narrow littoral zone. So they would probably only need to pass over there about 1 time. However, if you go to the South Lake or if you go way up to the north to where the tennis courts are, there's a large area where there's milfoil. So in that situation, they would probably do maybe 2 or 3 passes just to sort of get adequate coverage. And then after that herbicide goes in, I would expect to see start to see some damage on the plants within about 1.5 to 2 weeks. And then based on what we've seen in other studies, I would expect to see the plants pretty much drop out in about 1 month to 1.5 months. And that's basically based on Pond 3 and some other studies that I've looked at. And then after that, you know, hopefully that's when I'll come back about 2 months later, you know, 2.5 months later, sort of gauge the effectiveness there. And then just last thing in terms of residues, we expect that the Priscillacor should basically be a non-detect within 24 hours. That's what we've seen in other studies. If not, it'll probably be reduced by like 70 or 80% by that time. That New Hampshire study that I mentioned before that did drinking water, they saw the residue reduction to non-detect in about 3 days. But 3 days was their quickest sort of test, right? So it could have been lower before that, but that's sort of when they tested it. And once again, I apologize for the long explanation, but I'm trying to get everything in terms of the process.
Okay, thank you. We have just a couple minutes left.
Thank you, very,
Chris?
very thorough, appreciate it.
Okay,
Great.
Chris, any other questions in the 2 minutes we have?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, Trustee Shaw? Thumbs up, okay, there you go.
No, I'm good. I thought it was a very comprehensive presentation, so very educational for anyone.
Yes, okay, so AJ, again, thank you very much. That was a terrific presentation. And thank you to all the trustees and trustees-elect that joined us this evening on a Thursday, and also to everyone that joined us in the audience. Reminder again, get your questions to AJ and we'll answer them and post them all on the internet along with the PowerPoint presentation that he just gave. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.